Hello, good morning. Hello, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Without wasting our time, I shall start now. Today, we are going to study one more Keynesian theory called as the liquidity preference theory of interest. Just a minute. Hello, PPT slide this one.
Yes,
Hello.
sir. We can.
Okay, ठीक. Liquidity preference theory of interest has propounded by the modern economist Lord John Maynard Keynes in his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which was published in 1936. See, there are two theories regarding the determination of rate of interest. One is the classical loanable funds theory of interest, according to the classical loanable funds theory of interest. The equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between saving and investment. Saving and investment. According to classical economists, the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between saving and investment. But according to John Maynard Keynes, equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the liquidity preference of the people. According to John Maynard Keynes, interest is a purely monetary phenomenon. Interest is the payment for the use of money. Interest is the price of cash, and cash is a liquid money. According to John Maynard Keynes, interest is a reward not for saving but for parting with liquidity. To part with is a phrase, means to make sacrifice of liquid money or to make sacrifice of money in the form of cash. Once again, according to Keynes, interest is the reward not for saving but for parting with liquidity. According to this theory, interest is the price which equilibrates the desire to hold money in the form of cash, the desire to hold money in the form of cash with the supply of money. What is liquidity preference? Liquidity preference simply means demand for money. According to John Maynard Keynes, Liquidity preference means the desire to hold money in the form of cash rather than spending on goods and services. See, the desire to hold money in the form of cash is called as liquidity preference. John Maynard Keynes points out that it is the liquidity preference of the people which determines the equilibrium rate of interest. But actually, the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between the liquidity preference of the people and the supply of money. And the supply of money. Let us first take into account the liquidity preference, that is the demand for money. See, the rate of interest is determined by the equality between the liquidity preference of the people and the supply of money. Liquidity preference means demand for money. According to John Maynard Keynes, the demand for money, the liquidity preference, that is, the desire to hold money in the form of cash, is determined by three important motives. It means money is demanded for three important motives. One, transaction motive. Two, precautionary motive. And three, speculative motive. Liquidity preference is the sum of liquidity preference is the sum of demand for money for transaction motive, demand for money for precautionary motive, and demand for money for speculative motive. Hello, am I audible? आवाज येतोय? Hello, hello, hello.
Yes, sir. हो
Am I
सर.
audible? ऐकू येतोय आवाज? Let us see first of all demand for money for transaction motive. People hold certain amount of their total income in the form of cash to meet their day-to-day needs. See, people hold certain amount of their total income in the form of cash to meet routine and regular transactions. It is the need of cash. See, it is the need of cash for the current transactions of personals and business exchanges. It is the need for cash. It is the need of cash for the current transactions of personal and business exchanges. See, we know that people receive income at regular intervals. People receive income at intervals. During the interval, current transactions must be made, and therefore, to meet day to day's needs of the people, like purchasing of vegetables, milk, newspaper, hiring labor on daily wages, as well as purchasing of raw material require certain amount of money in the form of cash. It is called as demand for money for transaction motive. Demand for money for day to days needs is called as demand for money for transaction motive. Demand for money for transaction motive is represented by LT, liquidity preference for transaction motive. Secondly, precautionary motive. See, people hold certain amount of their total income in the form of cash to meet unforeseen contingencies like sickness, accident, the cost of higher education, as well as unexpected wants. We know that future is uncertain. Therefore, to meet the unforeseen contingencies and unexpected needs, people hold certain amount of their total income in the form of cash. It is called as demand for money for precautionary motive. And demand for money for precautionary motive is represented by LP. LP stands for liquidity preference for precautionary motive. Thirdly, speculative motive. There are some people who often take an advantage of fluctuating prices of goods and services in the market. See, when prices of goods and services falls, they purchase goods and services and sold it out when prices of goods and services rises. When prices of goods and services rises. See, prices of goods and services, even rate of interest always fluctuates in the market. So some people, in order to take the advantage of fluctuating prices of goods and services, even the rate of interest, hold certain amount of their total in the form of cash to make profit. The demand for money for speculative motive is called as liquidity preference for speculative motive. See, liquidity preference is the sum of demand for money for transaction motive plus demand for money for precautionary motive plus demand for money for speculative motive, and it is symbolically expressed as LP. LP stands for liquidity preference or demand for money is equal to LT, liquidity preference for transaction motive, plus LP, liquidity preference for precautionary motive, plus LS, liquidity preference for speculative. According to John Maynard Keynes, the liquidity preference, that is the desire to hold money in the form of cash for transaction and precautionary motive, is symbolically expressed as L1 is equal to LT plus LP. See, according to John Maynard Keynes, the demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive highly depends upon the size of income of the people or level of income of the people. The demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive is symbolically expressed as L1. L1 stands for demand for money for transaction motive and precautionary motive. It is symbolically expressed as L1 is equal to LT plus LP. LT stands for liquidity preference for transaction motive and LP stands for liquidity preference for precautionary motive. L1, that is liquidity preference for transaction motive and liquidity preference for precautionary motive, that is demand for money for transaction motive and precautionary motive, highly depends upon the size of income or level of income, and it is symbolically expressed as L1 is equal to function of Y. Y stands for size of income or level of income of the people, and F indicates the functional relationship between the liquidity preference for transaction and precautionary motive and the size of income or level of income of the people. The demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive, which is highly depends upon the rate of interest, indicates that higher the rate of interest, higher the rate of interest, lower will be the demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive. See, according to John Maynard Keynes, demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive highly depends upon the size of income or level of income of the people. Higher the size of income of the people, larger will be the cash balances held by the people, or larger will be the demand for money. On the contrary, lower the level of income of the people, lower the level of income of the people, lower will be the desire to hold money in the form of cash for transaction and precautionary motive. The demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive, which depends upon the size of income of the people, is not much affected by the changes in rate of interest. The changes in rate of interest. The demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive is interest inelastic, means changes in the rate of interest does not bring about any change in demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive. Why? Because the demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive depends upon the size of income of the people only. It does not depends upon the rate of interest. On the other hand, the demand for money for speculative motive, the demand for money for speculative motive highly depends upon the rate of interest. Higher the rate of interest, lower will be the cash balances held by the people, and lower the rate of interest, larger will be the cash balance held by the people for speculative motive. This clearly shows that there is an inverse or indirect relationship between rate of interest and demand for money for speculative motive. On the other hand, there is a direct and proportionate relationship between the size of income of the people and demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive. The demand for money for speculative motive is symbolically expressed as LP is equal to L2 is equal to function of R oblique I. R or I stands for rate of interest prevailing in the market. L2, that is demand for money for speculative motive, depends upon the rate of interest. Higher the rate of interest, lower will be the desire to hold money in the form of cash for speculative motive and vice versa. In short, liquidity preference, that is the demand for money or the desire to hold money in the form of cash, is the sum of demand for money for transaction motive, demand for money for precautionary motive, and demand for money for speculative motive. The demand for money for transaction, precautionary, and speculative motive depends upon two important factors. One, the size of income of the people, and two, the rate of interest prevailing in the market. It is symbolically expressed as LP is equal to function of Y. See, LP is equal to function of Y or and R. Y stands for size of income and R stands for rate of interest. LP means the demand for money. Demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive depends upon the size of income of the people, and demand for money for speculative motive depends upon the rate of interest. Demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive is interest inelastic, but the demand for money for speculative motive is interest elastic. The demand for money for speculative motive is sensitive to the rate of interest prevailing in the market. See, for your information, there will be a question in multiple choice questions. Demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive is dash dash. Demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive is interest inelastic, but the demand for money for speculative motive is interest elastic. We know that the demand for money for transaction and precautionary motive depends upon the size of income, but it does not depends upon the rate of interest. But the demand for money for speculative motive depends upon the rate of interest. Now let us see the supply of money. So supply of money in a given period of time is determined by the central government and the central bank of a country. Central bank of a country. Reserve Bank of India is the central bank of India. It means in a given period of time, the size of in a given period of time, the supply of money is determined by the monetary policy of the central government as well as the Reserve Bank of India. John Maynard Keynes further points out that in a given period of time, the supply of money remains constant, and therefore it is the liquidity preference of the people. It is the desire to hold money in the form of cash. It is the demand for money which determines the equilibrium rate of interest. We can explain this with the help of this diagram. So here in this diagram, x-axis represents LP, liquidity preference, that is demand for money, and SM means supply of money. LP is the liquidity preference curve, that is demand for money curve, slopes negatively downward from left to right towards the x-axis. This downward sloping LP liquidity preference curve shows that there is an inverse or indirect relationship between the rate of interest and demand for money See, at OM supply of money, see, vertical straight line to x-axis represents supply of money. At OM supply of money, OR rate of interest is determined. See, according to John Maynard Keynes, though liquidity preference of the people determines the equilibrium rate of interest, but in reality, the rate of interest is determined by the equality between the liquidity preference of the people, that is demand for money, and supply of money. So here, this LP, liquidity preference curve, which is called as a demand for money curve, intersects M supply of money curve, which is a vertical straight line to x-axis at point E. At this equilibrium point, when the supply of money is O, at this equilibrium point, when the supply of money is OM and the demand for money is OM, the equilibrium rate of interest is determined as OR. While the demand for money, that is liquidity preference, remaining constant, when the supply of money increases from OM to OM1, see, when the supply of money increases, the supply of money curve shifts towards the right. This new M1 supply of money curve intersects LP, liquidity preference curve, that is demand for money curve, at point E1. At this equilibrium point, when the supply of money increases from OM to OM1, the rate of interest decreases from OR to OR1. In short, higher the rate of interest, lower is the demand for money. Lower the rate of interest, larger is the demand for money. While the demand for money remaining constant, when the supply of money increases from OM to OM1, rate of interest decreases from OR to OR1. On the contrary, while the liquidity preference of the people remaining constant, when the supply of money decreases from OM1 to OM, the rate of interest increases from OR1 to OR. In short, rate of interest is determined by the equality between the demand for and supply of money. See, in this figure, there is only one liquidity preference curve, that is demand for money curve. And there are two supply of money curves. These two curves, LP, that is demand for money, and M, that is supply of money curve, shows that while, see, The liquidity preference of the people, that is demand for money, is given. The demand for money is given when the supply of money increases, the rate of interest decreases. On the contrary, when the supply of money decreases, the rate of interest increases. On the other hand, see, in this diagram, the effect of change in supply of money on the rate of interest is shown. The effect of change in supply of money on the rate of interest is shown. Now, see, in this diagram, there is only one supply curve MM, but there are three liquidity preference curve. This diagram shows that the effect of change in liquidity preference of the people, or the desire to hold money in the form of cash, on the rate of interest is shown. X-axis represents liquidity preference of the people, that is demand for money, and SM supply of money. Y-axis represents the rate of interest. LP is the original demand for money curve. This LP, original demand for money curve, slopes negatively downward from left to right towards the x-axis. MM, supply of money curve, is a horizontal straight line to x-axis. The vertical straight line to x-axis. This MM, supply of money, vertical straight line to x-axis curve, shows that in a given period of time, the supply of money remains constant as OM. In a given period of time, the supply of money remains constant. The supply of money is fixed as OM. See, while the supply of money remaining constant as OM, the original demand for money curve, that is LP, intersects MM supply of money curve at this point. At this equilibrium point, the equilibrium rate of interest is determined as OR. As OR. When the liquidity preference of the people increases, the original demand for money curve LP shifts upward to the right as LP1. This new LP1 demand for money curve intersects the same MM supply of money curve at point E1. At this equilibrium point, due to an increase in demand for money from point E to point E1, or from LP to LP1, the rate of interest increases from OR to OR1 to OR1. On the contrary, while the supply of money remaining constant as OM, when the demand for money decreases from LP to LP2, or from point E to point E2, the new liquidity preference, see, the original liquidity preference curve shifts downward to the left as LP2. This new LP2 demand for money curve intersects the same MM supply of money curve at point E2 at this equilibrium point. This is point E2. At this equilibrium point, the equilibrium rate of interest decreases from OR to OR2. In short, when the supply of money is given as OM, the rate of interest rises from OR to OR1 with an increase in demand for money. On the contrary, the rate of interest falls from OR to OR2 when the demand for money decreases from LP to LP2. In short, though, according to John Maynard Keynes, it is the liquidity preference of the people which determines the equilibrium rate of interest. The actual rate of interest is determined by the equality between the demand for money and supply of money. The demand for money and supply of money. This is called as liquidity preference theory of interest. Liquidity preference means the desire to hold money in the form of cash, the desire to hold money in the form of cash, in other words, called as demand for money. Demand for money. According to John Maynard Keynes, in a given period of time, the supply of money is determined by the monetary policy of the central government and the central bank of a country, and therefore it remains constant. It remains constant. Keynes states that when the supply of money remains constant, it is the liquidity preference of the people. It is the liquidity preference of the people which determines the equilibrium rate of interest. See, when the liquidity preference of the people increases from LP to LP1, rate of interest increases from OR to OR. On the contrary, when the liquidity preference of the people decreases from LP to LP2, then the rate of interest decreases from OR to OR2. But in reality, the rate of interest is determined by the equality between the demand for money and supply of money. So later on, in the third module, we are going to study ISLM model. See, ISLM model is a combination of the classical loanable funds theory of interest. The classical loanable funds theory of interest states that the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between saving and investment. But on the other hand, according to John Maynard Keynes, that is the liquidity preference theory of interest, the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between the demand for money and supply of money. The combination of or the integration of the classical loanable funds theory of interest and the Keynesian liquidity preference theory of interest is called as IS. I stands for investment, S stands for saving, L stands for liquidity preference, M stands for supply of money. See, money factors and real factors are combined together to explain how the equilibrium rate of interest is determined with the help of ISLM. Keynes has, the Lord John Maynard Keynes has rightly pointed out that the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between the demand for and supply of money. In a given period of time, Since the supply of money remains constant, it is the liquidity preference of the people, that is the demand for money, which determines the equilibrium rate of interest. Keynesian liquidity preference theory of interest has been criticized by various economists on the following grounds. The criticisms on the liquidity preference theory of interest are as follows. One, according to Jacob Wiener, see, according to Jacob Wiener, without saving, there can be no liquidity to surrender. See, without saving, we cannot sacrifice money. Therefore, according to Jacob Wiener, without saving, there can be no liquidity to surrender. See, one cannot sacrifice money. One cannot sacrifice money unless one has already saved money. Without saving, no one can part with liquidity. Secondly, according to critics, John Maynard Keynes neglected many factors which influence the rate of interest, like productivity, time preference, and saving. All these, etc., all these factors affect the rate of interest. Thirdly, according to Professor Robertson, see, Professor Robertson strongly criticized that this theory is unrealistic because bonds are not the only alternative to money. See, bonds are not the only alternative to money. There are so many alternatives to money. Then, according to some critics, Keynes has not clearly explained the term liquidity, and therefore the liquidity preference theory of interest is more confusing. And lastly, according to some critics, this theory is wrong. According to some critics, this theory is clearly wrong. If this theory is right, then the rate of interest would be high during the period of depression when the liquidity preference would be high. When the liquidity preference would be high. These are the criticisms placed by the critics on the liquidity, on the Keynesian liquidity preference theory of interest. Though the liquidity preference theory of interest has been criticized by many economists on different grounds, Keynes has stated that the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the equality between the demand for money and supply of money. This is the Keynesian liquidity preference theory of interest. जॉन मेनॉर्ड केन्स या आधुनिक अर्थतज्ञाने आपल्या द जनरल थिअरी ऑफ इंटरेस्ट, द जनरल थिअरी ऑफ एम्प्लॉयमेंट इंटरेस्ट अँड मनी नावाच्या ग्रंथामध्ये व्याजाचा रोख प्राधान्यतेचा सिद्धांत मांडला आणि हा ग्रंथ 1936 मध्ये प्रकाशित केला. केनच्या मते व्याज ही सर्वस्वी चलनजन्य घटना आहे. व्याज म्हणजे रोख पैशाची किंमत. व्याज हा बचतीबद्दल दिला जाणारा मोबदला नसून तो रोखतेच्या त्यागाबद्दल दिला जाणारा मोबदला. आपण पैशाचा रोख पैशाचा त्याग करतो म्हणून त्याचा मोबदला आपल्याला व्याजाच्या स्वरूपात प्राप्त होतो. केनच्या मते रोखता पसंती म्हणजे पैसा रोख स्वरूपात स्वतःजवळ बाळगण्याची इच्छा, त्यालाच आपण पैशाची मागणी असे म्हणतो. व्याजदर रोखता पसंती आणि पैशाची मागणी यांच्या समतोलाने निश्चित होते. सर्वप्रथम पैशाची मागणी. पैशाची मागणी 3 हेतूंसाठी केली जाते. 1 व्यवहार हेतू, 2 दक्षता हेतू, 3 सट्टेबाईचा हेतू. व्यवहार हेतू म्हणजे दैनंदिन व्यवहारांची पूर्तता करण्यासाठी लोक आपल्या एकूण उत्पन्नापैकी विशिष्ट अशी रक्कम रोख स्वरूपात स्वतःजवळ बाळगतात, त्यालाच आपण व्यवहार हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी असे म्हणतो. 2 दक्षता हेतू. भविष्यकाळ हा अनिश्चित आहे. भविष्यात उद्भवणाऱ्या समस्या सोडविता याव्यात यासाठी वर्तमान काळात व्यक्ती आपल्या उत्पन्नातील काही विशिष्ट अशी रक्कम रोख स्वरूपात जी स्वतःजवळ बाळगते, त्यालाच आपण दक्षता हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी असे म्हणतो. उदाहरणार्थ आजारपण, अपघात किंवा उच्च शिक्षणाचा खर्च किंवा अनपेक्षित घटना यांना आपण दक्षता हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी असे म्हणतो. त्याच्यानंतर सट्टेबाईच्या किंवा साठेबाईच्या हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी. अर्थव्यवस्थेत काही लोक बाजारपेठेतील वस्तू आणि सेवांच्या किमतीतील बदलाचा फायदा घेऊन मोठ्या प्रमाणात नफा मिळवण्याचा प्रयत्न करीत असतात. त्यांना आपण साठेबाजी किंवा सट्टेबाजी करणारे लोक असे म्हणतो. म्हणजे वस्तूच्या किमती कमी असताना मोठ्या प्रमाणात खरेदी केली जाते आणि किमती जेव्हा वाढतात तेव्हा त्या अधिक किमतीला विकल्या जातात आणि नफा मिळविला जातो. याला आपण सट्टेबाईच्या हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी असं म्हणतो. केनच्या मते व्यवहार हेतू आणि दक्षता हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी ही उत्पन्नावर अवलंबून असते. उत्पन्नात वाढ झाल्यास व्यवहार हेतू आणि दक्षता हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी वाढते. या उलट उत्पन्नात घट झाल्यास व्यवहार हेतू आणि दक्षता हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी कमी होते. व्यवहार हेतू आणि दक्षता हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी ही व्याजदरावर अवलंबून नसते, म्हणूनच त्यास आपण व्याज अलवचिक असे म्हणतो. पण तो दुसऱ्या बाजूने सट्टेबाईच्या हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी ही पूर्णतः व्याजदरावर अवलंबून असल्यामुळे सट्टेबाईच्या हेतूसाठी केली जाणारी पैशाची मागणी ही व्याज लवचिक असते. 2 पैशाचा पुरवठा. अर्थव्यवस्थेत एका विशिष्ट कालावधीतील पैशाचा पुरवठा हा केंद्र सरकार आणि देशाच्या मध्यवर्ती बँकेमार्फत निश्चित होतो. एका विशिष्ट कालावधीत अर्थव्यवस्थेतील पैशाचा पुरवठा स्थिर असल्यामुळे रोखता पसंती म्हणजे पैशाची मागणी अर्थव्यवस्थेतील व्याजदर निर्धारित करते. यालाच आपण केनचा व्याजाचा रोख प्राधान्यतेचा सिद्धांत असे म्हणतो. थोडक्यात केनच्या मते व्याजदर पैशाची मागणी आणि पैशाचा पुरवठा यांच्या समतोलाने निश्चित. हॅलो, डू यू अंडरस्टूड? समजलेलं आहे? व्हॉट इज लिक्विडिटी प्रेफरन्स थिअरी ऑफ इंटरेस्ट? हॅलो हॅलो हॅलो.
Yes, sir.
ओके, आपण इथेच थांबूया. वेळ झालेली आहे. and we shall continue one more new theory in the next lecture. Thank you. Bye. Good day.